Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and having interest in the history of the development of Jack London. There are a lot of experts in the room, I can tell. First of all, thank you to our fantastic hosts of the new Overland. It'll be called the Overland. It's soon to be open. Aren't we all excited to come back and have a burger and beer here? Big round of applause to Paul and Steve. Paul's in the cowboy hat, appropriately. Steve's around here too. Our terrific panelists, thank you so much for being here. We're going to hear from Mitchell Schwartzer, who's the author of a very recently published article I think some of you had a chance to read before tonight on the recent development history of Jack London. Richard Sinkoff of the Port of Oakland, he's Director of Environmental Programs and Planning. Long title is, and Gary Connect, he's what more can I say? No, he's involved in a longtime resident of Jack London, and also involved in the estuary plan and the cultural resources survey, where we learned a lot about the history of our buildings down here. And Patty Rossi, who is owner and proprietor of the Fat Lady, a beloved institution in our neighborhood. So, before we get started, there's one other thing to announce. We're raising funds for the Train Quiet Zone study, which we'll hear that tonight. And the top 6 donors will receive a free box of Baya pasta. So, without further ado, let's turn it over to our expert panel.
Is this one work? Yeah. Hi, so I'm again Mitchell Schwartzer. I teach at the California College of Art. I'm an architectural and urban historian. And among other things, I've been writing some articles about the history of the city of Oakland. And Civic Center here, an article about our neighbor, Emeryville, and the like. And I think I guess some of you got to see this article around on Jack London Square, but what I wanted to do is start off, I'm going to start off giving a little history from the middle of the 20th century to now, and then Richard is going to talk about...
Yeah, I'm going to lay a foundation of some of the natural factors that have shaped Oakland's waterfront.
And then the 4 of us I'll ask some questions and we'll have a little panel discussion. And this will all go about 45 minutes, and then apparently we have about the same amount of time it's for questions about any of the things that come up tonight, okay? So...
And I'll be handing out cards for the questions.
Yeah. So, I got interested in Jack London Square. In the early 1980s, I wrote a historic district plan for the San Francisco waterfront when I was working as a city planner for the city. And over time I got interested in the history of this waterfront, and I looked at it. Eventually I came up with a kind of structural way to look at the history, and I divided it into a series of phases. For those of you, and probably no one is in the room, was around in, or maybe someone does remember 1951. Does anyone remember 1951? What happened here? No one. Yeah, you'd have. Yeah. I think the story in Oakland is similar to the story in a lot of cities, to a point. That this was the oldest part of Oakland, right? Oakland begins right here, at the corner, where Broadway meets the estuary, and expands inward. And the Kellersberger plan, the early plan, the 1851, 1852, is based on this corner, right? So, there was no concept of Jack London Square. Really, this was just the genesis of the city of Oakland. And Oakland expanded inland from the waterfront, and as a city on the waterfront, developed a whole maritime industry alongside, which I think we'll hear a little bit about, yes. Like almost every waterfront district in the United States, and most industrial districts, as industry and maritime activities prospered, as they got more intensive, as they grew, they outgrew their spaces in their original areas. So this area of the waterfront very early on, already by the early 20th century, was kind of outmoded. And most of the larger shipping, the piers, the ferry terminals, and a lot of businesses start moving away from here, up and down the estuary, right? Toward 9th Avenue and then out toward the outer harbor. And so what you get during the early part of the 20th century is a kind of gradual, I would call, abandonment of most of the waterfront. And bringing in of secondary uses, a lot of lumber yards, storage facilities for raw materials and the like. And this is the case, I would say, everywhere in the United States. I mean, pretty much most waterfronts underwent this kind of transition as businesses moved outward. And like San Francisco across the bay, and I think inspired by San Francisco, Oakland, San Francisco had a larger merchant shipping fleet, fishing fleet that was based on the northern waterfront, what we now call Fisherman's Wharf. And they started to sell fish, and they started to sell seafood after they caught it. It was, an activity that was going on, and then someone thought to, more formalize it and develop a stall, a permanent stall, and then someone thought to have a restaurant, and one thing led to another, and the idea of Fisherman's Wharf really started going by the 1920s and 1930s. And Oakland, always aware of San Francisco, always competitive. In 1938, a restaurant opened here, where Kincaid's is right now, just about that location. The Oakland Seafood Grotto. And it was the first kind of Oakland attempt to create a Fisherman's Wharf-like atmosphere for Oakland, except there was no fishing fleet. So they weren't offloading the crabs or the fish, they were actually trucking them in, but still. Yeah. And by 1951, there had been another restaurant had opened, a second restaurant, and a third was planned. And civic leaders got together and said, look, we should formalize this. We should actually create a district that could attract tourists. And since Jack London, the author, had hung out in this region and done all sorts of activity, at the saloon, he was a regular, ended up there, passed out at the end of the day after his, oyster pirating. You should read the John Barleycorn book and all, his exploits on the waterfront in the 1890s and early 20th century come up in a series of his writings. But since he had been here, since he's an Oakland native son, famous author, the idea was to associate, and since he was associated with the sea and shipping, it made sense in a way to actually dedicate this little constellation of restaurants, and they're really like 3 restaurants, Jack London Square. So it's only a few blocks, just a few restaurants right around the corner of Broadway and the estuary. And it grew over time, over the course of the 1950s and into the 1960s. More restaurants came. Some decommissioned steamers were used as a restaurant and for a time, and then they would go away. Some motels started popping up. Other businesses started coming in. The television station was located down here for a while. A small convention center was built here. So it started to, a larger set of activities aggregated around the restaurant core. In the 1970s, I would say things accelerated even further when Cost Plus opened up. There had been a Cost Plus in San Francisco since 1958. They opened up over here in I think it's 1973 or 4. A wax museum opened up. San Francisco had 3. Oakland developed a wax museum. And then Jack London Village, which you probably, some of you remember, opened up a bit over, up estuary from here as an attempt to kind of compete with what was going on in San Francisco, specifically Ghirardelli Square and the Cannery. The idea of creating a retail place with restaurants and small shops. This was Oakland's answer to those developments which happened in the 60s. So the square keeps getting larger, but it's still pretty disorganized, the development. And I would say the first attempt to really organize it in a systematic way occurred during the 1980s. It was called the Jack London's Waterfront Plan. it created a lot of the infrastructure that you see along the waterfront, a bit of the harborside walkways, that Water Street passage, those buildings that function as Water Street, the office building right over here, where the port has its headquarters. These were all parts of that 1980s plan. And then I'll just say there was another plan that happened in the 2000s, which was called the Jack London Market Plan. You're probably aware that was more recent. The idea was to create a festival marketplace. Excuse me, one thing I didn't say, I should have said, that Jack London Waterfront Plan was very much modeled and in competition with the Pier 39 in San Francisco, which opened a few years earlier. So again, Oakland was trying to, match, and that was commercially extraordinarily, and still is, extraordinarily successful. The Jack London Waterfront Plan of the late 80s was really unsuccessful. Most of it was vacant. The plan was to actually bring in Williams of Sonoma, Sharper Image, the kind of stores that you see, Trader Joe's, the kind of stores you see in shopping malls, and the kind of stores that went to Emeryville, that Emeryville built a small regional shopping center. And there's a lot of history here about shopping in Oakland that could be talked about, but we don't really have a lot of time. So I just want to get through this basic history. So the plan didn't work out that well. The port ended up developing that plan, became the lead developer and financer when some other financiers dropped out. And the Barnes & Noble bookstore, the movie theater came on this side over here, and those were probably the big successes that happened. But for the most part, it was a kind of mixed bag in terms of the ambitions, which was really to create an active regional shopping center. And then in the 2000s, there was one more big development effort, which was that Jack London Market, and which also, another big hotel was planned that didn't happen. There was going to be a marketplace that was 3 times the size of the Ferry Market in San Francisco, 3 times as many stalls, and I think there's 1 restaurant at the base that's ever opened. The offices have done okay, but retail has stayed away. And then they built the Ferry Landing building too. Both plans, the 80s plan and the 2000s plan, did extensive landscaping that has improved the visual quality. But I think what we'll talk about in the panel is, or ask questions and discuss, and we can discuss it, is, what were the reasons why, historically speaking, over this 65 years or so, the square never developed into the kind of active zone that the port wanted. I think that the city of Oakland wanted, a lot of business people had wanted. What were the reasons why? To this day, there's still a lot of vacant spaces. There's plan now for a couple of high-rise residential buildings. It's still a work in progress, and so that fascinated me. I'm like, wow, 64 years as a work in progress. But in a way, it's kind of a parallel to Oakland and a lot of Oakland's unrealized ambitions, and yet it seems like right now we're at I think, a very interesting turning point where things actually might start happening in a much bigger way, not just here, but throughout Oakland. So that's just a set of observations about the kind of infrastructure, the business infrastructure that developed over the past 64 years since the naming of the square. And maybe now Richard will talk a little about some of the natural qualities.
Yeah, thank you, Mitchell. Let's see. Before we all turn around, I prepared some slides, and they're on that screen. I don't know whether it's going to be possible to actually see those images. So we're going to do a group vote here. I can sort of talk about the images, and then you can see them later. See them now? Okay. I like that, dictatorship.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry, people over here.
All right. So some of you have chairs that can sort of move around a little bit, and I'll go through this quickly. Alrighty. So how's that visually for most of you? Can you see? Okay. Great. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Richard Sinkoff. I'm the Director of Environmental Programs and Planning for the Port of Oakland. I can honestly say this is your hometown port. You should be very proud of the Port of Oakland. We're the 5th largest container port in the United States. And we also own and operate Oakland International Airport, and we have responsibility for properties from the Bay Bridge all the way to the San Leandro line. So, you know, as Oaklanders, you should be extremely proud of the role of the port in the development of the city. I also want to point out that there are lots of subject matter experts in the room, including Betty Marvin, who I see here. Many of you know Betty, who works for the City of Oakland on the Landmark Survey. It's been a colleague of ours at the port on a lot of work that we've done. And then Diane Heinz, let's give a big shout out for Diane, who organized the whole history tour, has actually been the key advocate with Ann Whittington for the Port Archives. Carol Jones also is here. She's an alumna of the Port of Oakland's real estate division, has also been helping us. So we have lots and lots of people in the room who have helped out. Okay. So given Mitchell's interest and Gary's interest, what I thought I would do is talk about something else, which is there are lots of other forces that shape the world that we live in. We're interested in planning, we're interested in the built environment, we're interested in development, but there actually are natural and environmental forces that are always at work in shaping the places that we live in. And the Oakland waterfront is a fantastic example of that. So it really is the interaction between human activity, human communities, and the natural environment that give us a sense of this particular place. Can you go back to the very beginning? Okay. All right, so first slide. Just go, can you advance it? There you go. Okay, so many of you may know that before there was the City of Oakland, before there was a Port of Oakland, much of the area on the east side of the bay consisted of a very rich ecological system of shallow water, tidal marshes, sloughs, and vast areas of wetlands. One of the big issues regionally, as you know, is now to restore and reclaim many of those vital wetland areas. So this is a view looking across the San Antonio Creek marshes. The estuary was known as San Antonio Creek. And this is a view really from Alameda looking across. You can see all the ships at the Port of Oakland, high-mast ships in the sailing era. So it gives you a sense of what the shoreline looked at. What I'm going to be talking about, and you're going to see this theme back and forth, is the tension between what I call hard edges and soft edges. But the shoreline at that point was soft edges. Next slide. So here's Water Street. It looks very different in 1884. So this was really a rough and tumble pop-up city. I just wanted to point out something that Mitchell said, this constant tension with San Francisco. I found a fantastic quote in Beth Bagwell's book. And this is a quote, just so we don't feel at all inferior in Oakland. Many people noted that those who gave the matter any thought, what's that? Many of those who gave the matter any thought considered Oakland a much better place for a town than San Francisco. And really, it was only the discovery of gold in 1849 that led to the emergence of San Francisco. And San Francisco's advantage was, of course, not the climate, not the soil, not the location, it was the deep water. Oakland did not have deep water. Remember, this side of the bay was very shallow. So it was in competition with San Francisco, but there were people early on, like Horace Carpentier, who immediately saw the value of creating a port over here. Next slide. Okay, so this is a bird's eye view of San Antonio Creek. So this is what we now call the estuary. You can see Lake Merritt over here, and you can see that it was already a very, very active waterfront. This is probably from the late 19th century. Next slide. Okay. Do many of you know that the island of Alameda was once connected to the Oakland shoreline? How many of you know that? Okay. So it was the Army Corps of Engineers that came in and dug something before the Panama Canal. They dug the tidal canal. And the whole idea behind the tidal canal was to harness the hydrology moving from San Leandro Bay through the estuary to naturally scour the bottom of the channel so that we wouldn't have to dredge it. Dredging, as you know, is a constant activity at the Port of Oakland to maintain that underwater highway. But the Corps of Engineers thought they would use natural systems to make it naturally dredged. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but what it did do is it liberated Alameda from the mainland, and they've never come back. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to point out in these slides that this was always a working waterfront. We should be very proud of it. There were lumber yards, there were mill yards. Oakland's waterfront was truly a working waterfront with a multiplicity of uses. This gives you the character. The reason I mention that is today, to this very day, staff at the Port of Oakland and developers along the waterfront are still dealing with the legacy contamination from many of these uses. Until we had environmental laws in the 1970s, basically people did whatever they wanted with their property. So one of the issues we deal with in development is a lot of cleanup, and that actually affects the types of buildings that can be built here and the type of development we can have. But it's a very, very important part of our past. Keep going. Okay, so this just gives you a sense. We started to shape and harden the edges. That's what we do when we build pier structures and wharf structures. Next slide. But still, there was a vast area. This is looking towards the middle of the bay, the area that we now know as Middle Harbor, where we have Middle Harbor Shoreline Park. These were the piers that went out into the bay to finally get to some deep water. So the ships going back and forth, the key line, the ferries, all could reach deep water. Next slide. And what we end up with over time is all of those soft edges become this incredible geometry, these hard edges. So here's the approach to the Bay Bridge. You can see the Emeryville Crescent, which is still a natural shoreline, and you can see all of these, incredible hard edges. This is the outer harbor at the Port of Oakland. Keep going. Some more examples. Next slide. Okay, and I just want to point out, as so many people have come back to the waterfront to live here, many years ago, no one wanted to live down here, or very few people. And the reason was there was heavy industry with smoke, with coal plants, with electric plants. It was not the cleaned up, sort of sanitized waterfront we know today. Next slide. And here's an example of that. That's really what it, in fact, when you worked at the Port of Oakland, you got hardship pay, because these were really rough jobs that you had to, it was hard to work on the waterfront. And this is really what the waterfront looked like for many, many years. Keep going. Okay, here's our namesake, Jack London. So, wait 1 second, the industrial waterfront at work. What I wanted to show here, again, was one of the key planning methods that we've had in the United States. And it's somewhat in tension with natural forces and shapes. Here you have Oakland creating a classic grid system on the waterfront, not really responsive to the natural environment, but the street system in Oakland, Telegraph, San Pablo, all of those are really heading in the right direction. They're going towards the other center on the East Bay, which was Berkeley. And so these streets here start to respond to the natural contours and the natural direction, whereas the grid, in a sense, is somewhat superimposed. Just like in San Francisco, it's a superimposed street system on a natural environment. And it creates, in some respects, sort of awkward pivots and turns. The other thing I want you to pay attention to is we think of the estuary here as being a water body right in front of us, but actually the key movement here is that it arcs. It really arcs to the northeast. to the northwest. And that actually has had a tremendous influence on the shape of piers and terminals at the Port of Oakland. Keep going. Okay, so this gives you a better sense of that arc, that movement. I'm going to show you just a few images a little bit later of how we've resolved that tension. But the point I wanted to leave you with was that we're always dealing here with this superimposed grid, this Euclidean math, and the natural form. The natural forces want to do their thing, and we, in our human communities, we want to do our thing. And that sometimes creates opportunities and sometimes creates a lot of interesting design problems. And you can see the pier structures here trying to resolve that as they try to reconcile, being, orthogonal to the grid and actually being correctly aligned with the flow of the water. Okay, next slide. So this, I took this morning actually, shows you how beautiful the waterfront is, but here you see the bend. Okay? So next time you go out and take a walk on the waterfront, if you go from KTVU down to Clay Street, watch how that moves, because that really is the thing we've been trying to capture in the design of Jack London Square with the view corridors, and it still is a major opportunity. Many of the buildings here don't really respond to that. They still look straight out, as if Alameda and the Peninsula Hills were really the opportunity. They sort of failed to capture that, but not in every case. Okay? So when we did the Jack London Square plan that Mitchell was talking about, not surprisingly, it just follows the grid. Now, in some respects, it did respect the view corridors, the existing view corridors in the street of Oakland, but it didn't really think about the arc of the estuary itself. So all the buildings look that way. Very few of them are really facing in the right direction.
That's a plan from the 80s.
That's the 80s plan. And here you have Water Street, which has been, next slide. Water Street sort of does the same thing. So for those of you who have thought about why isn't Water Street animated, why doesn't it really work, maybe one of the reasons is it's not looking at anything important. It's just looking, it's really just looking in the wrong direction. And that's why it's not alive, okay? But as we started to develop new properties, this is the movie theater. The movie theater is right here. That was a coal gasification plant. So that was actually where one of the first plants in Oakland produced gas for the streetlight system. That was actually a project that I worked on, one of my first projects here at the port, and we had to deal with a lot of the contamination issues underneath that building. There's a very interesting ecological history on all those buildings. But the key thing here that we tried to do was start to respond to Washington Street, to make sure the building had a relationship, and I forget your name? Pat's going to talk about the Fat Lady, which is also on Washington Street. So we started to think about really creating another corridor down from the city center on Washington Street to sort of, reflect what was going on Broadway, to create another walkable corridor. And the way you do that is you start facing the buildings onto the street itself, as opposed to doing what everyone was doing before, which was towards the estuary. So we sort of started to turn things around. Next slide. But here's the interesting project. I don't know if many of you know the Landing. So the Landing is the only housing project that the Port of Oakland has built. And the reason for that is that that particular property was a railroad property, not part of the Tidelands Trust. The Tidelands Trust, which are the granted lands, do not allow us to build any housing on the waterfront. However, this particular property was railroad property, not subject to the trust, so we could do housing here. It's over 300 units. And the key design challenge here was how to reconcile the grid and the arc of the estuary. So this is the way we planned it, and believe me, I can tell you it was a big struggle. The center corridor here aligns with the street system, right? So if you go to this area, there's a public access area dedicated for the public, and it goes right up, I believe it is Harrison Street, or maybe Harrison Street, goes all the way up. So aligns with the grid. Next slide. Is it Alice? Okay. But here, you can see what we did was we beveled the facades. So these particular units are facing in the right direction finally. They're facing towards the west. These people have extraordinary views because finally they're looking at the right thing. They're not looking at Alameda. What they're looking at is the magnificent port, the shoreline, and San Francisco in the distance. So this again shows you how we accomplish that. So these units again are looking down the estuary towards, its natural arc going, towards San Leandro, and these units are looking towards the port. And here you can see this issue. I just wanted to put in this historic photo because these piers already were doing that. So in a sense, we have the design vocabulary already in place. We just have to pay attention to it. So here are terminals that have their street facade oriented towards the grid, and the water side is oriented towards the natural arc. The sheds are oriented towards the natural arc of the water. I think there's one more. And then I just wanted to suggest as we look ahead that we have many opportunities, we continue to have opportunities to think about where should those soft edges be that continue to reflect the natural system that is at work. So that's a design question. We've tried to reference some of that at Jack London Square. This pattern, which is in front of Forge, is really intended, this paving pattern, if you look at it, if you can get up a little bit, is really intended to reflect the natural shoreline. That was the intent there. The wave action and then where the shoreline originally was, just to give us a visual cue that something is operating. Actually, many of you may not know that those promenades are all pile supported, and there's actually an active beach underneath. Okay? And then, this was the last slide, I took this again today. I also wanted to suggest, as planners, people interested in planners, that there's a lot to be gained by the juxtaposition of textures and different uses on the waterfront. So the cookie cutter approach may not be the direction we want to go in, and let's leave opportunities for texture, for juxtaposition, and for some serendipity. This happens to be, of course, Alameda. And I think that is probably the missing piece to Oakland's waterfront, is that we really also need to think about, it is a unified corridor and not just Oakland looking out, sort of into a vast nothingness. So I love this, the color there, and I wanted to leave you with that. Okay, so that's it.
Okay, so what we thought we would do is just bring up a couple of, I will throw out an issue and then we'll have the panel talk about that issue. Maybe a good place to start is the issue of connectivity and corridors. As Richard says, the Water Street and most of Jack London Square follows, parallels the Oakland City grid. Another question about the viability historically of the square, of the entertainment part of the square, has been its connections to the rest of the city. That one of the and its environment, it seems somewhat of an isolated or cordoned off area. Part of that, possibly one of the reasons why there was less attention to the kind of northwest view, is that you do have a container, facility right on the edge of Jack London Square in that direction, which made things difficult to orient the square that way. But equally, the square has had a hard time, it has been kind of cut off from the, the shoreline in the opposite direction toward Jack London Land, toward that apartment complex in there. And then the question becomes, this street, we've been hearing that the trains go by. Is this an important barrier too? And has the square been, has the kind of linkage between Broadway and the rest of the city and the square been adequately dealt with? So any thoughts about the connectivity of Jack London Square, or isolation, or the like?
Yeah, lots of thoughts, but I think Pat and I are both non-port planners, operators, or whatever, and can talk a little bit more about the rest of the district and add a little sort of perspective from the other side. I'm the youngster of the two of us. She's been here 800 years, and I've only been here 30 years. She was in this building in what year? 1950. Okay, I didn't get here till 1982 or something like that. So she has a better perspective than I do. But in looking at the history here, from 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad showed up and blocked off both 7th Street and 1st Street or Embarcadero, there was an isolation of this part of town from all of downtown. And in fact, if you pay attention to Old Oakland, that was really sort of the developed first, architecturally developed downtown. And then it moved up to City Hall, and then it moved up to where well, it eventually ended up at Lake Merritt. But this part of town was the backbone. It had railroad tracks from in the 19th century on both 7th Street, 1st Street. And there were points at which you could not even get to the water up until the Supreme Court of California gave the port back to the city in 1907. And the city immediately turned to Western Pacific Railroad, gave them a franchise, and they built 2 railroad tracks that went down 3rd Street. So from 1910 until the tracks were taken out on 7th Street, which I don't know when that was, and mid-90s on 3rd Street, you had 3 railroad tracks separating the water from the rest of downtown, number one. Number two, in the 50s, they finished the Nimitz Freeway from Oak Street to wherever with this 2-decker structure. So access, there's never been any access. The only access was to get to a bridge down Webster Street or Alice Street that went to Alameda. But in 1928, October 27th, dedicated, they opened the Posey Tube to Alameda, the other sort of point of access that used to bring folks through this area, disappeared underground. And just in case you're interested, we're going to be paying a lot of attention over the next few years to the connection between those 2 tubes now and the Nimitz Freeway. There are plans of because they have to develop the Naval Air Station in Alameda, and that's going to put a lot more traffic pressure on the streets of Oakland. So you want to pay attention. Never mind the 3,000 units that are being developed on the waterfront down here at Brooklyn Basin that may put a few more pressures on us. Alameda's going to do that too. Chinatown will suffer first, and then we'll get the rest. But you had all this stuff to prevent people from getting down here. You both beautifully described the sort of working area it was. It was not a pleasant area. 1951, they said, okay, we're going to call it Jack London Square.
Well, here's a segue. I mean, in a way, one of this, you know, if you look at other waterfronts around the country, and one of the things that they have built upon is our historic resources, historic buildings or piers or other elements, like, you know, Ghirardelli Square is a great, that factory building which was repurposed, or the Cannery are good examples. Boston did it with, you know, various buildings on the Boston waterfront, Baltimore, Chicago. And I'm curious about what people think about, you know, the historic resources. What role do you think they played in the development of the entertainment district, or what role did they not play in?
Well, the other point I want to make is there really are 2 planning efforts that have ever gone on. There's what we in the private sector who own private businesses in the private sector do, and what the port does, which is it relates to Tidelands Trust Land, it relates to shipping, it relates to air, and of late it relates to commercial development. In the last, well, you could say it started in 1952 when they called it Jack London Square, but that was building on something that was here, and it tried to make it go somewhere. You were in this building at that time, and I think the Oakland House was definitely a part of the area down here. And I would be very curious to hear you describe sort of what it was like when it began, and then you can talk about the access. And well, you might want to offer some opinions about what it's changed.
Well, I'm going to come from a totally different perspective because architecturally, the place was very eclectic and very, you had standalone businesses that drew you to this area. You had large open spaces that allowed you to see the area. My memory of the area was it was definitely a walking area. Sidewalks were filled with people that would walk from place to place, just because it had, when I visited New York and people said it was a walking city, that's what I remember as Jacqueline Square. The Maritime was pretty well gone. It was now called Jacqueline Square. The broader, Kincaid's was the first establishment that was part of Jacqueline Square. It was actually the Quonset hut in front of that location. So when they built after a fire, it was Kincaid's building that was very predominant, and the Seawolf, which is now Scott's. Those were the two main architectural structures that kind of held Jacqueline Square as this new modern entertainment area that competed with San Francisco. You had other establishments, one that was across the street, which is now empty parking place here. Where the plank is, it was totally a flat surface parking area, so that when you drove down the corridor of Broadway, which is the main thoroughfare that ties Oakland together from east to west, north to south, it was the gateway to this area. So I remember Jacqueline Square as having easy access, people feeling safe, people having fun, and people coming to experience the whole area. It was also a time where every business had its own look, so that with development, sometimes we build very square buildings and then we fit things into it, and that was what I felt that the 80s development took away from Jacqueline Square, was that element that we just developed a personality, and then we lost the personality, and we lost, I think we lost our feng shui. It feels like a maze down here to me. For people who come in here now, they love it. It feels very active. To me, I'm comparing it to what I remember. And it had more connectivity. So I think in developing, you always have to remember what is it that you really need to think about saving, and where is it that you have to go. Because you can't hold on to everything, but there has to always be that balance of when are you going to tip it and lose what it is. I agree that Oakland is far superior to San Francisco. We should not think of ourselves as a semi-process city. And in Oakland, you look at San Francisco. So we have the best view of the Bay Area.
How about maybe just in general then? I mean, do you think there were any missed opportunities over these many decades? Things that could have happened that, would have made the square a more vibrant place earlier?
Well, one of the things I was shocked when they did it in the 80s is they took all the trees out of Jacqueline Square. And if anyone experienced that, every night I got off of work, I drove through Jacqueline Square. just because it was like Rockefeller Center. It was so phenomenally beautiful. And we took all the trees and all the lighting, but it was the fact that you could drive through the area and you felt
And park
and park.
for free.
So I kind of equate Jack London Square with San Francisco took down the Embarcadero Freeway. We have put a freeway, and we have hidden Jack London Square.
Okay. Any thoughts about you know, opportunities for more open space in the square? You know, we don't have you know, there's not a lot of open space on the estuary, and one of the things that's has struck me is you know, I bicycle around a lot, and you know, there's amazing open space along the I guess it's the channel that should, you know, eventually I guess is going to connect, you know, to Lake Merritt, and once did. And there's a whole big sculpture park there. There are works by Michael Heitzer that are totally abandoned. It's really bizarre, and you know. And then there's a park right at where the estuary meets the channel, a big, that's kind of also seen better days, and is not that connected to here. So it does seem like, I found it interesting or odd that, you know, that connectivity between these relatively underutilized open spaces and the square has never, to this day, really been actualized. There's, you know, you have to kind of figure it out on your own. You know, and I'm curious about.
I think there are two factors that are infrastructure related that do, well, three, the train, the road, Embarcadero, and East Bay Mud has a huge, I guess it's a sewer pipe that runs through there. And those do prevent any easy crossing of that area. There is a plan afoot to build a bridge over there that I think is still active, and does anybody know if it's...
There's a plan to actually, yeah, they're building a bridge on 10th, and they're planning actually to 7th. There's a plan to actually make bicycle and walking connectivity very easy. It's still a ways away.
Oh yeah, and it'll...
But you know, that channel park was actually a sculpture park that was run by the Oakland Museum.
I think they still own
But they seem to have, I talked to them about it, and they've kind of lost track of it. And I wonder, is that something that happens in Oakland, that you get a great plan and then people forget about it 10 years later, and then you do another one a few blocks away, and then because we had some great efforts, and they're not all that coordinated.
Yeah, every time somebody comes up with an idea, they change it. That person moves on to another job, another city, and somebody else comes in and they have a new point.
Yeah.
And I just want to caution everybody that there is this planning effort that's coming up for all of downtown. My observation, I'm not a planner. You guys are planners. You know the formality of it. I'm not a planner. I have a Master of Architecture. I like looking at things that are pretty and interesting and whatever. I was hired by the Oakland City Planning Department to look at buildings, and some of them were pretty and stuff. But I observed planning in the city of Oakland for a number of years, and my observation is that you come up with a general plan, and maybe it goes on a shelf, and you come up with elements of your general plan, they go on another shelf. Every now and then, it actually affects zoning. Okay, zoning does matter, because it supposedly defines what you can or can't do in a particular area, and in theory, in traditional zoning, you keep housing over here, and you keep all this industrial stuff over here, and you know, then you have a healthy city. Every time a new general plan comes out in this city, it seems to me that whoever did it leaves for somewhere else. Somebody else comes in, and it just sort of takes a long time for them to get their head around that plan and do anything. And I think at a smaller scale, and Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at a smaller scale, the same is happening with development on the street itself.
I have a quick question for the audience, well, and I'll give you a chance to read through the audience's questions, and if there are more, please pass them forward. Of the people, does everyone remember the first time they went to Jack London, or came and set foot in Jack London? How many people, this is their first time here? Okay, nobody, that's great. How many people, the first time they were here was in the 2000s? How many people the first time they were here was in the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s? Any 1950s? Wow. Okay. There. Thank you for humoring me.
So, these are your questions. And one question that I would have asked was a big element in waterfront revitalization around the world has always been to create a big anchor, like an aquarium or another type of museum or some other. And the question that's perhaps pertinent for today is, how would a stadium, I imagine a baseball stadium, not the Raiders, the Oakland Athletic Stadium, how would that affect the square? And is that a good idea? And do you think
I think it'd be great. I mean, it's an entertainment area, and I think there's space down here. It would be awesome if it's for the A's.
Would be.
I don't disagree, but my wife has concerns.
Yeah. Okay, that's it. Well, here's another question about additions. We mentioned earlier the idea that there might be a couple of high-rise housing buildings put in the square itself. How do you think that would change the character of the square? How do you? What are your?
Well, go ahead, Richard.
The addition of a lot of housing in the middle of the square, not on the edges, but in the middle.
Well,
Is that working?
I think everyone can hear me. So one of the things that does characterize the square, but it's changed now with the Ellington, has been, it's what we would call a low-rise character. So I think one of the things to think about in terms of development is the relationship between essentially the foreground, that character of the square, which is characterized mostly by 2-, 3-, and 4-story buildings, where the port cranes are essentially your symbolic, I would say, landmark element. They really are the thing that defines the waterfront, and what makes the waterfront in Oakland special is those are not post-industrial cranes. Those are working cranes. Those really represent the vitality of the port, which means over 73,000 jobs and all of the economic development. So one of the things to think about in terms of high-rise development that's going up, and I know it's already been approved, is that relationship. And I'm not sure that they're necessarily incompatible, but it will change sort of what we call the visual character of the district.
Let me just comment. I think it was a stupid thing to approve, and it's consistent with my opinion. No. It's done deal, so forget about it. I think the residential aspect of it is great, but the estuary plan, where I had a little tiny advisory role as a citizen who could be ignored, but I watched it sort of up close until the council took it apart and turned it into something else. The theory in the plan was you would have low rise near the water, and it would rise slowly till you got to the freeway, and you'd put your tall buildings. And it's fine to do planning, it's fine to say things in a general plan, but in order to do this, they had to change the general plan before they had even put the zoning that was in that general plan into place in this Jack London district. So we have the old zoning, but it has to conform with what's in the general plan that's now, what, 15 years old, 16 years old, 17 years, it just keeps going. And what worries me a little bit about doing more planning is unless we pay attention, get our voice in there and stick around for a long time to make sure it's implemented, somebody else come along and do something different. Oakland has sort of this history of plop things, and the port, more than anybody, plops stuff down all over the port area, and it's sort of like plop public art. It's an 80s thing. It's over. Let's get over it. But these are going to be two things that are plopped down. The development community has said this is what we can build and this is why we need to build it. And so this next planning effort, we'll accept the plops, we'll build on the plops, and if we're smart, we'll figure out how to incorporate them and make something good about it. If we're stupid, we'll change, forgive me, the wholesale produce market and turn it into housing and just have a big pile of high-rise housing like the Ellington that just sort of goes wall to wall all the way up to Oak Street. It's your call, folks, now.
I kind of agree with Gary in the fact that if you're talking about Jack London Square, you're talking about accessibility. One of the things that draws somebody to an area is how it feels at its core, and if its core feels chopped up, then you've lost what it is, so that you can be there and you don't know you're there. And a lot of that has to do with height, what draws you to something. And Central Park in New York, you're drawn to Central Park because Central Park is at street level and a city surrounds it. So I think that when you're thinking about developing in Jack London Square and you're calling it a square, where is the square?
You know, given the fact that we talked about most maritime uses have left a long time ago, most light industry and warehousing has also left the general area, and yet the produce market is still there. And now there's a lot more housing pressure. What do you think the viability of the produce market is long term in terms of staying where it is and functioning in this kind of higher development climate?
Let me just say that the only reason it's still there is because the floor area ratio in the general plan is 1.5 for those blocks, meaning you can build a story and a half. If it was any larger than that, you would have lost it a long time ago. If that changes, it's gone. I mean, the financial pressures are abound. There are even people in this room who are eyeballing it and drooling over it and wanting to develop on it. I'm just saying, I love it. I came here 33 years ago, and the thing I loved about the district was not necessarily the asphalt parking lot I knew as Jack London Square or any of the restaurants there, but it was the wholesale produce market and the sort of, this was the only part of the city that I knew that was 24 hours. It's not what most planners think of as a 24-hour city, but it really was a 24-hour city.
And I think that especially people that live in Jack London Square, you need to really think about what it is that drew you here. If you're moving to the country and then they're building strip malls, are you happy that you're in the country and now it's strip malls, or did you move to the country because it was country? And the same thing with Jack London Square. It's very eclectic. That's what makes it unique. Where else are you going to find something that is living and breathing, and that we're not in sterile boxes?
I'd like to open it up for other questions if people have. Yeah.
Most great plans take a look at the assets that are available. I think everybody here kind of feels that the produce market is one of those assets. And the problem has been uptown, City Hall have not figured out, first of all, reuse for the produce market, which has to go to retail if the wholesalers move away. And the wholesalers have to move away because they were at a facility that's too old to house that kind of environment anymore. So the problem is that no matter how many plans you come up with, It's the enforcement of it at City Hall. If we're going to have leaders there that will say, we want to follow through on the community planning effort that was done, then we can do that. So what advice do you have as to how that can happen and have the port be part of that plan too?
Do we have any, does anyone know actually the status in terms of preservation for those buildings? Like what protection they have?
It's in a historic district.
So they are their own historic district?
Then there's some talk about taking it out of that historic district and changing it.
Oh my God, yeah. So I mean, from my perspective in looking at the history of the square, I was actually looking at mostly at the side on the other side of the tracks toward the estuary, not this side. But I mean, that for me, those few blocks of the produce district are probably one of the most significant, I think, architectural areas in the entire city of Oakland, by far. I can't think of anything on the West Coast like it. Places like that tend to get redeveloped as high-end restaurant, bar areas, which probably would be better than, obviously better than tearing it down. In San Francisco, many of you may not know, there was a huge produce district that was right where Embarcadero Center is right today. They tore it down right on the northern edge of the financial district, similar to this. It was actually. So, but that was done, you know, that was torn down in the 1960s. So I can't imagine in the 2000 teens that we would do something that mad to take out you know, something. Yeah.
The magic of the produce market has been blessed recently by the cleaning team that's been down there. I go out to Jack London Garage and I don't mind going through all the trucks and everything in the morning. I think it's kind of exciting, but I didn't like the mess that was left during the day. But the cleanup now, at the end, when the trucks are gone, it's so much nicer. So we have the excitement and a nice environment when they've left.
So things are working better then, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here. Each one contributed so wonderfully to our knowledge. Regarding what Richard's presentation was about the railroad housing, the landing being the first, actually Portobello was built in 1974 by the railroad as a condition of, so they had built housing there. So that was actually the first housing at Jack London Square.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the port. Jack London Square is a precious commodity for us at this point. Does the port have any incentives to develop that as an open space resource as opposed to maximizing the income that comes to the port? In other words, what are the incentives, if any, to make that a better livable environment?
So are you referring to the area, sort of waterfront, the waterfront side of the Embarcadero?
Yes.
So the development of the final parcels is governed primarily by the estuary plan. So it's really no longer the port's decision. There's a framework in place to develop those specific parcels. One thing I wanted to add, though, which is a little bit of perhaps a modification on what Mitchell said, another force that's very, very active on the waterfront is the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. For those of you who have heard of BCDC, it's the state regulatory agency that governs all development in San Francisco Bay and within 100 feet of the high, we call it the mean high tide line. So public access is a requirement of all waterfront development. So to your question, anything that is in BCDC's jurisdiction has to provide what is called maximum feasible public access consistent with the project. So for those of you who are interested in development on the waterfront, you have a major lever, a hammer, to ensure that whatever is built here goes through an extensive review of public access, and the developers have to provide that. If it's in BCDC's jurisdiction, it's an absolute requirement.
Other questions? Comments?
Question. Could you comment on what you see as should be the differences between development patterns east and west of Broadway? Specifically, there is no residential development west of Broadway now. Should it remain that way in order to maintain the eclectic character of that part of the Jack London district?
Opinions?
This is a panel speaking about history, and I'd be happy to explain to you why it got that way. When we get into discussions about what's happening in the future, I think that was the panel last month's panel. What I can tell you is most of this area was always, first zoning I'm aware of was 1917, when the city said produce market, open selling of vegetables and fruits has to happen between 7th Street, the Estuary, Fallon Street, and Broadway. So that created a produce market. Whenever zoning was laid over that, most of it followed the existing uses and was manufacturing. A little bit of it, where the wholesale produce market was commercial. Okay, everything on this side of Broadway was also commercial, but almost everything on this side of Broadway was manufacturing. What manufacturing zone said was, unless you create a joint living and work quarters, which is a relatively new concept, you may not have any dwelling units. So there really were no housing units here, other than about 12 of them in old buildings. 3 Victorian houses. On Castro Street, there's a 4-unit building. Above the warehouse, there's about 3 units. And in the 1980s, my wife and I created 2 joint living and work quarters. And so people think of me as a pioneer. I was just looking for space. But in any event, they were legal. I was working for the city. It damn well better be legal. Well, I guess I could have done it. But the history of the development here was in 1988, a developer looked at a parcel on 3rd Street, where now 288 3rd Street is located, and said, I want to put housing there. I know the railroad's winding down. I know the railroad on 3rd is going to leave. And he hired an attorney, and they went through the process in 1989. The manufacturing zone for most of that side of the remaining part of Broadway changed to commercial, which allows mixed-use residential and it was not until 2000 that we started getting the new construction. The landing and, what do you call that one? No, the 3 buildings, the other 300 units, Broadway and Jackson. Allegro got built. Those were the first 600, and they're still rental units. Pretty much everything else, except Aquavia, was built as condominiums. And those all happened starting in 2000, 2001. The population before that, there were less, if you include 200 units over in Portobello, there were rehab buildings during the 90s that totaled maybe another 175 units or something like that. It was a very small population in this area. We're now up to over, not quite 2,000 units in the area.
I just want to say one thing before I pass it on to Pat. So this is from my perspective, a more personal perspective than an official Port of Oakland perspective. But again, be aware of the fact that Port of Oakland really is a significant economic force. And what that means is not only do we perhaps all benefit from the goods and services that we receive when you buy your new computer, you buy your new washing machine, whatever it is that you're doing, but over 73,000 people in Northern California are connected in some way to the port business. we've estimated we've actually estimated in our own economic analysis, nationwide, it's over 800,000 people are connected to the Port of Oakland's business. The area west of Broadway is essentially a kind of a buffer zone, and all of you know this. As people move in, even though they may like the cranes and they may like the idea of living next to a port, the reality of living next to a working port with the truck queues, with the gate operations, with the noise, with, the rail, starts to, they think, well, maybe not. So look at that area. I'd say look at that area as one of the few buffer zones where there still is manufacturing, there still are other uses, there are a lot of people working there. And when we move in with our residential units, we put pressure on that. And that could put pressure on the port. And the port is now pinched because we have obviously ongoing development in West Oakland and gentrification. There's Emeryville, and now it's coming from this direction. So it makes it hard for the port to operate in a way that's compatible with these other uses. Not official policy.
Can I just comment? Vivian had asked a question that and Gary was answering. But Gary, you were saying that this side of Broadway, you're actually on that side of Broadway than the answer of the Broadway that you were answering. And there have been and are many residential areas, and it is a mixed use on the west side of Broadway, this side of Broadway, that have been in existence and do continue to be in existence. A lot of old properties, old Victorians, but also there's a 29-unit condo unit that
Live work.
work.
It's not residential.
Yeah, it is the zoning that defines Phoenix Lost as joint living and work quarters.
But I know that I, as a person who bought a little humble, tiny little house, has legal ability on the wrong side of Broadway. Jack London District, that we're supposed to be talking about here, has a lot of various activities and residents and everything else. And so I just wanted to step up and say that it's not black and white. It's not east and west. And
Actually, you're in a commercial zone there.
mixed use.
Well, a commercial zone is what the city calls it. Well, 5th to 4th is a commercial zone. But it wouldn't matter because your dwelling is old enough that it's there, grandfathered in, no matter what.
Gary, when we moved here, I did my research and everything else. There's a different terminology to it, but I know what you're saying. You and I have been working together for all these years. There's, Jack London District is broad,
Right.
and there are more complications than were being discussed here.
Other questions?
Hello, just one more question, and then maybe if each of you has a final thought about the shaping, the forces that have shaped our neighborhood.
Yeah. One last question.
Yeah, some of you already mentioned that, but I happen to love the train, at least during the day, not so much at night, because I feel like it really creates the atmosphere of Jackson for a new kind of life. Can any of you comment on both the history and maybe the potential plans or not plans?
Need to change the train? I don't know. Are there any plans to change?
I guess I was saying...
There are going to be more trains, guaranteed.
No, I was saying that in the context of if it gets more developed and there are more people living here, I already know there's a guy that's quiet zone.
There is an effort to create a quiet zone, which would mean there would be fewer horns honking. It won't eliminate the noise of the train, the charm of the train, the thing I love about the train, but it would reduce those heavy-handed engineers who probably recently ran into somebody somewhere. And if we did a train quiet zone, it would put gates over both sides of the street as well as over the sidewalks to remind inebriated celebrants that they should stop and make it a little more difficult for you in your car to pull around a gate, even if it isn't working. Those are the only plans that I've heard about.
If I have a closing thought, it would be that in this area, it was once primarily business forward, and you had like-minded people who were thinking in terms of they needed to park on the sidewalk, they needed to have deliveries, they needed to function as a business. We now have a very eclectic area, and I think that's what makes this unique and rich and attractive. So I think it calls for the best of all of us, because we all have different needs, and in order for us to maintain the fragile balance of this area, we need to understand and appreciate each other's needs when we move forward and stand up for this area that a lot of us call home, whether it's because we work here or because we live here.
Or because we do both. No, amen. It is a fragile area. It will change. It will continue to change. And the best I can hope for out of any of this planning process is that we'll pay attention to that fragility of the district and the many different things that go on in the district, and enhance those that are here. Not copy San Francisco or anywhere else. Let's celebrate Oakland, and let's celebrate Oakland in the Jack London district.
And I guess my closing thought is recall that the first wharf in Oakland was created right here at the foot of Broadway. There's a plaque commemorating that. That's where the port began. The port is very much an active part of Oakland's present, but certainly past, present, and future. It affects people from all walks of life, and it's a major gateway for imports and primarily for exports coming out of the Central Valley. So as you think about the future of your homes, your businesses, I hope you will become more and more connected with the port.
I guess my sense is that I think in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years since we started coming out of the Great Recession, I think Oakland has entered into a new phase of its history. You know, I think the city, had people forget that it wasn't a gold rush city. You know, it was actually, the gold rush didn't do that much for Oakland. It was a really small place all through the 1850s compared to a lot of other cities around the Bay Area. And then really, there was really the railroad coming here, the western terminus, and then the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. Those were, and then the Second World War. I think those were the three big moments for Oakland that really pushed Oakland up. And then there was a long down period. White flight, capital flight, industrial flight, starting in the 50s and lasting all the way through the 90s. When Oakland really was not receiving investment, new buildings weren't happening, and we developed a crime problem, which it still has to this day. And I think, from looking at the kind of broader history, I think San Francisco, we talk about San Francisco a lot, and I lived there and I loved it, and I live here now and I love it. I don't see the two as antithetical or in competition or one better than the other, but I do think, my sense is that San Francisco is kind of in an advance in terms of development patterns. And that if you look what's happening in San Francisco, the shrinkage of the black population, it happened there first, it's starting to happen in Oakland. The intense gentrification of San Francisco, the kinds of things that are happening in San Francisco, the way tech has enveloped the city over the last decade, these things are going to happen in Oakland. I don't think it's a doubt in my mind that they will happen. It's a question of how they're managed. So we're going to have, it's really a question now, we've entered this phase of not just taking development desperately, which I think for so long Oakland wanted any development. I think now it's a question, we really have to think about what kind of development we're going to have, and not lose the city in a way that I think, what I hear every day practically, because my college has campus, we have campus on both sides of the bay, is people feel San Francisco is being lost. That it's becoming so homogeneously rich that anyone who's not rich feels they're increasingly out of place there. And it never was like that. Since its founding, it never became, and it's really becoming like that. And I think it's becoming like that because it's becoming a world city, like London, like New York, like Tokyo. And world cities are famously really expensive and exclude and develop this kind of a different kind of social stratification. But I don't see, it's too close for it not to spread over here. And so I think that's the big challenge for Oakland, is to figure out, we're going to have to grow. There's going to be a lot of people, they are coming over here in droves. How do we plan for that in a way that we don't lose the port, we don't lose industrial activities, we don't lose the kind of diverse population that we have completely, like San Francisco is losing. So we can learn from them, because we are kind of following a few, a decade or two after them. I think we can learn and watch what's going on in San Francisco and try to manage things a little bit more sensibly. But it's tough. I think the economic forces are so powerful, that it's going to be a real struggle, as you can see, what's going on in the West Bay. Not to get you down, but it does mean development's going to be coming here, so that's a good thing.
Thank you so much, Patty, Gary, Richard, and Mitchell. I think we all feel, in Richard's words, a little closer and more connected to this neighborhood. And thank everyone for their attendance and participation. There will be more panel discussions. So thank you, and come back here when they're serving burgers and beer.
Yes.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you. A round of applause for our panelists. And everyone read Mitchell's article. It's terrific. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you.